Well, good morning if you are in Santa Monica, California. Good afternoon if you're in Union City, New Jersey, or New York City. Good evening if you are in Vienna. And good evening and good later evening if you're in Bethlehem. Welcome
Yeah.
to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. Adagio, as you know, is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. Um, my guest today, and today is April 18th. It's Good Friday, April 18th, 2025. It is Good Friday, so those who celebrate, wishing you good things. Passover, wishing you good things. Eat your matzah. And people of all faiths and people who are not religious, I wish you all the same thing: peace, good food, family, love, music, pleasure, whatever it is you want, as long as it doesn't hurt anyone else, it's yours. That's what I wish you on this Good Friday. And my guest today is a gentleman named Peter Danish, whose work I have known, but we've never conversed. So therefore, I'm going to learn along with you listeners around the world about Peter Danish. In Italian, there's a word that would describe Peter, un creativo. And this is a person who just innately is creative and uses his creativity not in just one pursuit, but in many pursuits because he has many gifts. And therefore, we're going to get into some of these gifts. But primarily, I want to talk to all of you and to Peter about a play that I have seen twice. The wonderful play that he wrote that's appearing now in New York through the 4th of May called Last Call. And we'll talk about it more later. Um, and it's a play I know will be performed elsewhere. I'm certain of that. It will have a very long life. It's a classic kind of play that is of great human interest, whether you know and love classical music or know nothing about it. It's of great historical interest. It's funny, it's moving, um, it's surprising, and I won't give away the surprises, but that's what good theater is. It's a good play. Henrik Ibsen could have written this play
Hmm. Thank you.
if you went to Vienna.
If I went to Vienna, that's
He
I can't disclose that yet, but we're
went
very
to
close to
Leipzig, he
Vienna.
went to Italy. But anyway, Peter Danish, welcome.
Thank you
Um,
so much, Fred. I really appreciate it.
let's start by talking about this play, Last Call.
Hmm.
Um, I will tell a little about it, and then I want you to tell more.
Certainly.
It takes place in 1988 at the Hotel Sacher in Vienna,
Correct.
where I have put away millions of calories in my life, from Tafelspitz to Sachertorte, of course,
Mhm.
to all kinds of things, to tea. It's an institution. It's right behind the Vienna State Opera House. It's on
Correct.
Herbert von Karajan-Platz. Um, when I have been to Vienna a lot, I've worked in Vienna a lot. I go out walking the street, and one time you run into Thomas Hampson, in the
Mhm.
past, Leonie Rieseneck. Um, somehow, all the musical world passes through Vienna, either for work or just because
Yes.
they want to be in Vienna. It's a wonderful city. I adore it. And so, therefore, the play is set in Vienna, and you can feel Vienna beyond the walls of the
Mhm.
room where we meet the two characters, three characters, actually. Um, but also one of the characters, a waiter, is very much the Hotel Soccer. He's the institutional memory there. He has
Yes.
seen everyone. He has to be discreet, but occasionally he will see someone who just is dazzling to him and he drops his cups.
Hmm.
And so start, Peter, by talking about your having gone to the Hotel Soccer and talking to a waiter.
Well, you set it up perfectly. About I think it was a little over 10 years ago. I was on vacation in Vienna, and my reading material that I brought along is right up there. It's the collected Leonard Bernstein letters, which had just come out. I'm a big fan of reading collected letters because I've always found that biographies are slanted. But when you read the letters, and you see how someone talks to his tailor, to the butcher, you really get a sense of the humanity of people. And reading the Bernstein letters was just wonderful because his voice just comes through. And it's so cool that one minute he's talking to a leader of state, the next minute he's complaining about his tailor breaking the buttons on his shirt. So it really brings a sense of the common humanity, and brings it really really home. So I was reading the book on the trip, and I, confession, had never had Zuckertort.
Mm.
I had steadfastly avoided the touristy things, and I was on vacation, and my wife she's less touristy than me. She had zero interest. And I said, you know what? I really want to try this. She said, I'll see you later. She went to one of the museums, and I went into the Zocker. And I went into the Blue Bar, and it was late afternoon, and I was the only person there. It had just opened up, and the very nice waiter, and when I say very nice, I'm being entre comillas, he was ignoring me for quite a while as I was trying to get his attention. And finally he stopped and he looked down at the table and he saw my book and he patted the book. And I said, "Oh, have you read it?" And he said, "No, no, no, I have not read it. But I did wait on Maestro Bernstein many, many times." I said, "Oh, that's wonderful." He said, "He was very beloved in this hotel. In fact, we recently renamed the presidential suite the Bernstein Suite." I said, "Wow, that's pretty cool." I said, "I'm up to the point in the book. He's in town to get an award. They're going to make him an honorary citizen of Austria." And he says, "Not Austria, of Vienna."
Yeah.
I said, "Oh, okay." So I said, "Okay, this guy, I'm not going to fool with this guy. He knows his stuff." Um, and he says, "I'll tell you a little story that's not in your book." He said, "The night before that ceremony, the maestro was staying in the hotel, and it was one of those very rare nights when both Maestro Karajan and Maestro Bernstein were in the hotel. And we had very strict rules. Keep them apart." Said, while on the surface, they were very, very good with the media, both of them. I mean, they crafted their personas in the media in a very good way, and always gave the impression that they were just, artistic rivals, and that deep down they were friendly and they got along great. And um, in doing the research for this book, I found out that wasn't always the case. And that the management said, to the extent possible, keep them apart. Well, late one night, they ran into each other in the lobby just outside the Blue Bar, and they had their respective entourages with them. And Karian took him by the hand and pulled him into the Blue Bar just to basically have a little bit of quiet. And they sat down on one of the little seats there, one of the little settees.
Yep.
And I said, "Which one did they sit on?" And he said, "The one right there." And I said, "Would you mind if I took my Zuckertort and my coffee and sat there?" And he said, "No, be my guest." So I sat there and I says, "What did they talk about?" He says, "Oh, I would never listen. I would never," very proper Viennese waiter, "I would never listen." But
Mhm.
so he said, "I did overhear them a little bit." He says, "In all honesty, my English was not so great back then. It was 30 years ago." And he said that they did say a lot about, "It hurts when I do this, it hurts when I do this, it hurts when I do this," like two very sick old men would probably do. He
Which is
said
what they were.
yeah, which they both would be gone within a year or so, right after
Yeah.
this meeting. Think about it. They were at the
Yeah.
end.
Yeah.
And he said that they seemed to be getting along fine, and he thought it would be proper to stand outside and not stay in the restaurant while in the bar while they were chatting. So he just went out into the hallway outside, and he says, and it got a little heated. He said between the two of them, there was finger pointing, and I said to myself, boy, to be a fly on the wall for that conversation. Can you imagine what would these two guys want to say to one another
Yeah.
at this point in their lives? you know? And so I said to him, let me have another cup of coffee. And I instinctively took out my laptop and let the spirits kind of guide me and said, Herbert,
Mhm.
Leonard, talk to me. And I sat there for about 2 hours and wrote about, oh, 30 pages of dialogue. Not a play, but just an imagined conversation
Yeah.
about what would they talk about. And it begins with health. And that health moves into what are you working on now, which moves into the art, which moves into the politics, which moves into the future. So that was kind of the arc of the story. And then the first thing I did was I have a buddy here in Nyack, where I live. That's in the Hudson Valley in New York, about an hour north of Manhattan, for those of you who are
Mhm.
not familiar with New York. A friend of mine named Jerry Grossman, who is the principal cellist with the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra.
Yep.
Years ago, Jerry played for the New York Philharmonic, and he played under Lenny for a couple of years, and he knew him fairly well. I asked Jerry, would you do me a big favor? I've written this thing, and I don't know if it's any good. Would you take a look at it? I don't want you to be a dramaturge or anything, but what I'd love you to do is just take a red pen and let me know if any of the dialogue just rings untrue, if it doesn't sound like Lenny. He said, okay, I could do that. And he did. And he came back. He said, this is wonderful. This is so much fun. He says, there's a couple things that Lenny would never have said that you put in there. So I just kind of circled them and said he might have said it this way, not that way. And he asked me, would you like me to share this with any of the other players? And I said, I would love you to. And next thing I know, about six other players had my manuscript in front of them, and they were carving it up, saying he would have said this. This is how he would have put this. This is, and it was extraordinary how suddenly the whole picture of him was coming together. And I was hearing the voice as related to me by these guys. But that presented a bigger problem because suddenly the Carrion felt very flat and very antiseptic and clinical, like the Carrion you see in the videos. So he said to me, I know a fellow who played trombone for him for 37 years. If you'd like me to give it. I said, are you kidding? He said, yeah. And so the process began again, only with the Carrion team, folks that played in Vienna and in Berlin.
Lynn.
And they gave me a whole slew of suggestions. And suddenly the characters burst off the stage, or off the page, I should say, at first. And a play started to reveal itself. And I realized that I wanted that kind of Greek chorus to keep the action moving. And also, as you put very, very adroitly, to let everybody know this is happening in Vienna. And Michael,
Vienna to me is a big character in that play.
it absolutely is.
Yeah.
And I've gotten a little bit of pushback from people who don't get that. Um, Whether they haven't been to Vienna or they think that the waiter is a bit of a caricature of yeah, thank you. There's a reason why
They're
things
over.
become cliches. But um it was a lot of fun. It was a labor of love. Uh but it got to a point where I was becoming obsessive with it, tinkering with every word and every, would Lenny say it this way? And I'll tell you, one of the reasons why was there have been other plays about Bernstein, and there's obviously the famous movie.
Yeah.
And boy, you get a lot of criticism if you get anything wrong. Um,
Not
and I
only
wish,
get things wrong, but perceived as being wrong,
yeah,
because
and
there are factual
exactly.
things about him. I knew him very well.
I know.
I met him when I was 6 or 7, and I knew him for the rest of his life. So well, he died in 88, so I was in
Yeah.
my 30s, 40s, something like that. So I knew him for a very long time. And I cooked for him. I know one of his children pretty well. I knew his wife, Felicia, somewhat. He was a guest in our home when I was a kid a fair amount. He
Hmm.
would talk about music in our home, but also about politics, about
Hmm.
social issues. about the civil rights movement, about all kinds
Mhm.
of things that were not necessarily about Gustav Mahler or Johannes
Of
Brahms,
course. Yeah. Yeah.
or Benjamin Britten, just to name a couple. Um, he did. I mean, he was the best teacher there was, and therefore, if I asked him a question about the Brahms First Symphony, he would
Hmm.
have an answer,
Yes.
and a
Unquestionably.
very wonderful answer. My experience in general with conductors is that they're very bright people and very
Yeah.
knowledgeable and they know how to express. There are the ones who are a bit too above it to want to communicate with a kid, but most of them are only too happy to teach and
Yeah.
share and
Yeah.
nourish musical love and interest. And I get it from conductors mostly in my
Hmm.
upbringing. But I met Von Karajan. I could never claim to have known Von Karajan at all.
Hmm.
I met him on a couple of occasions, one in a work setting, one in a social setting, both in Salzburg, where he was from.
Hmm.
And I didn't he was a small man, but he was an icon, and he loomed very large. And
Hmm.
basically, there was this swath of Middle Europe that was basically his territory. And Bernstein would come, and Schulte and Abato and Muti, and you
Hmm.
name the other, Lauren Mazel, you name the conductors, they were there, but it was his.
Yes.
And he was the person who any music lover compared the others to. Um,
Yeah.
I just want to have one thing about these two is that when I was coming up, I had a relative who was in the recording business, and this relative worked for Columbia Records, which was
Hmm.
Bernstein.
Bernstein. Yeah.
Deutsche Grammophon was Von Karajan, and London Decca was Georg Schulte.
Yep.
In my view, coming up, there were not the two conductors, there were the three.
Hmm.
And yes, there were many, many, many others, but there were these big three.
Hmm.
And I know that Schulte did not walk into that room with Bernstein and Von Karajan, but they all were big ego, very talented
Yeah.
people. Schulte was a very fast worker. He was very um,
Yeah.
tempestuous, but very Hungarian. He had paprika in his veins, and he could get people excited in different ways from how Lenny or Karajan got people excited.
Hmm.
And although when I'm always asked who were my favorite conductors, I say the ones I learned the most from were Bernstein first in terms of chronology, then Claudio Botto, who to me
Hmm.
was the most influential person conductor I knew, and then
Hmm.
James Levine because I worked at the Met for many years, and Levine
Reasonable.
was
Yeah.
a terrific communicator
Yes.
and very passionate. And I had the good fortune of getting an hour with him every month for most of his life, where I could come in with questions and sit down and basically ask him, tell me about Brahms. And I
Hmm.
mentioned that because he spoke a lot about Brahms for someone who I
Yeah.
never heard conduct Brahms, apart from
Hmm.
the German Requiem, I think, and the
Okay.
Alto Rhapsody.
Yeah.
But I don't think I ever heard him conduct symphonies or piano
Hmm.
concerti. But
I don't think I have either.
Levine was younger than these other guys, but he
Hmm.
also was of a very different style.
Yes.
Whereas these three grand maestros were products of the either born during the First World War,
Hmm.
growing up between the wars, being conditioned by the wars in their very different ways. Schulte and Bernstein were
Absolutely.
Jewish,
Hmm.
and the directions they took musically, professionally, and so on, and the burdens they carried for the choices that they made politically. And I'm not here to pick one or the other right now, but
Hmm. Hmm.
their careers were very conditioned by world politics in a way perhaps that James Levine was not. If
Yeah.
he had political views, he didn't express them much.
Hmm.
Claudio Abbado had very strong political views, but he didn't necessarily bring them into the opera house.
Hmm.
And his actions politically were more by gesture and
Hmm.
by influence. He was very much an environmentalist before everybody was, and wanted 90,000 trees to be planted in Milan because the city was incredibly polluted.
Hmm.
And he made efforts about the environment in different places, and he did it quiet. He was a quiet,
Yeah.
magnificent
Yeah.
man. Um, but Karajan I want your opinion. Did
Sure.
Karian cultivate his myth, or was he really mythical and he didn't have to cultivate it?
I think a little bit of both, but I'll tell you an anecdote that was told to me by James Galway a
The
number of years
flautist?
ago.
Yep.
Galway played for Karajan, and Galway said he was telling a joke about his beard, um, saying Karajan had a strict rule, no facial hair, like the New York Yankees, you know.
Mhm.
And uh, Galway said, "Well, I've had this forever and I'm keeping it." And Karajan said, "Well, I'm telling you, you're not going to play if you don't shave the beard." And Galway spoke to the chief, I don't know who it was, of the musicians, and found out that the city of Berlin actually owns the orchestra, and you can appeal to the town fathers. And at a particular time, Karajan, even though he was, the director for life, he had a very hot and cold relationship with the people that were there. And that's one of the reasons Bernstein is one of the reasons,
Yep.
because he never wanted Lenny to conduct there. And Galway won and apparently was allowed to keep the mustache and the chin hair. And he said that Karajan went back into the film studio, and cut Galway out of every single frame of 40 movies.
Hmm.
He says you'll hear all these flute solos and you'll see Karajan, you won't see Galway playing. So, and another hilarious story told to me by a player for Karajan who asked not to be named. He was a New Yorker who played for Karajan for 35 years. He's one of the fellows who helped me with the editing. And he talked about 1979, the Easter Festival and then the Summer Festival, uh, in Berlin. And he said that very interestingly, Bernstein was never, Karajan never actually said he cannot conduct here. It was kind of unspoken.
Hmm.
So no, he never invited him
Yeah.
to come. And that was how it worked. Karajan gave out the invitations apparently for other conductors to come. And he never asked Bernstein in 30 years to conduct the Berlin. So you've got arguably one of the top two or three orchestras in the world, um, never seeing the most popular, if not the best conductor in the world because of one man's ego. And then famously, uh, for the festival, which was in 79, in October of 79, the uh, town fathers invited Bernstein to conduct the Berlin in 79. And he famously did the Mahler 9.
Hmm.
And the reviews, I'm sure you've seen them in your research over the years, like Lenny conquers, Bernstein is God. They were just went crazy for him. The musicians loved him. They worked late with him without asking for overtime because they enjoyed working with him so much. And finally, one of the critics said, "These musicians haven't played like this under Karajan in decades," and that hurt him. Uh, and they were about to go into the studio to do a recording. He said he thought it was Symphony Fantastique, but he wasn't positive because it is a long time ago. He said, so we showed up for rehearsal a few days later after Bernstein had left town, and we're about to start work on this, preparations for the recording. Said when the librarian walks around the studio and takes the music off of everyone's stands and gives them Mahler 9. And apparently, up until that point, Karajan hadn't recorded a lot of Mahler. Um, he did after that, and some magical recordings after that. But he went into the studio in November of that year. He rushed them into the studio to do that first studio recording of Mahler 9 with the
Hmm.
Berlin. That was not the greatest recording. And now I found out why, because they rushed the darn thing. And, and the player said to me, the reason why was he had a deal with Deutsche Grammophon, and Lenny had just come over to Deutsche Grammophon. Remember, he switched
Yep.
allegiances, so
Yep.
they were both on Deutsche Grammophon, and Karajan got his Mahler 9 out within 3 months, and they put Lenny's Mahler 9 on the shelf, and it never came out until after he passed away. And that was the kind. So you say, did he modulate his persona? Yeah, he was, and in a certain sense, he was very petty and vindictive about these things. Um, you mentioned Schulte, and there's a letter from Schulte in the Bernstein book too, talking about, in my play, I'm sure because you just went to see it again, they talk a little bit about Karajan's first appearances at Carnegie Hall in the 50s after the war, at the behest of Bernstein, who said,
Yep.
you should come. Um, and Schulte wrote Bernstein a letter protesting, saying, it's your call, it's your city. He says, but I don't see how you can invite this man. And
Because of what? I know
because,
why, but because of what?
well, because Karajan was viewed at that time as being a Nazi sympathizer and a Nazi party member. And he was a Nazi. I mean, the fact is, he was a Nazi party member, and he renewed his allegiance a second time to them. Whether he was an active member in any capacity, the history doesn't show any real efforts. But that's one of the stories that's touched on in the play.
Hmm.
Whether being a passive member is just as bad as being, an active member. And it's funny because it was not meant to be a cautionary tale about today, but it's kind of become a cautionary tale about what
Yeah.
we're dealing with right now in the United States, regrettably.
Yeah.
So I'm not
Um,
going to get political, but I'm just
no, I
saying,
know. We
draw
get
your
a
own
little political,
conclusions,
but
you know?
a few nights ago I saw the play for a second time. And when I came out, I don't frame questions ahead of time when I do these
Mhm.
conversations. I like to just go where the conversation goes. But I
Sure.
did have one question for you based on seeing it a second time. Did you, Peter, and did you, the right, if those are the same persons, have more sympathy for one character or the other of the conductors? I mean, not the not the waiter.
That's a very good question, and it's very interesting you ask, because I will say yes and yes, and I will also say that sympathy and that allegiance vacillated as I did my research. It went from one to the other and back again, and um, everybody bases their art on their own lives to one degree or another. My wife is Bosnian, and she was a frontline medic during the Bosnian War.
Hmm.
And so she was a soldier, and she saw every imaginable horror that you and I just can't even imagine. I guess except for maybe what's going on right now, um, regrettably. But
Yeah.
the subject of judging from far away, I remember in the 90s when Bill Clinton did not want to help the Bosnians, because he thought the Serbs would overrun them in a week,
Hmm.
sort of like Russia, and
Great. Yeah.
very, very similar. And so we didn't get involved. And then after a month, 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years, holy, these guys are not going away quietly. And we've allowed a slaughter to happen just by standing on the sidelines. We didn't
Same
actively do
with
anything.
Clinton in Rwanda.
Similarly,
He
yeah.
often said that he regretted that he basically looked the other way and there was a massacre happening
Yeah.
between the Hutus and the Tutsis.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's, I compare that because that comes up. I won't, no spoilers here, but that subject, active participation versus active passive. passivity. Um, and it's a tough question, and I don't think there is a right or wrong answer.
No,
Uh, and you know what I'm saying, right? That I
I
think
came out
that,
with my opinion of who you felt
yeah,
sympathy for. Um,
okay.
I didn't have this opinion the first time I saw the play about a
Hmm.
month ago. Um, and obviously, when actors are in a play and audiences are
Yes,
coming, plays evolve
reactions
and the
and yeah.
theater evolves. So, um, it was a different kind of night. It was a different kind of audience. I sat in a different kind of seat for the second time, so I experienced part of the set and part of the action differently the second time. But I definitely came out feeling that you had a softness for, or a place in your heart for Herbert von Karajan.
Hmm. You know, it's interesting you say that because I will tell you a hilarious, very brief anecdote. When we were doing readings, we rehearsed the play in Germany because my director, Gil Memert, is kind of the Hal Prince of Germany. He's directed over 150 shows there and all over the world. This was his American debut. And I was very lucky to get him to work with me on this. And when we were doing the readings and the read throughs in Germany, almost to a man, everyone said, "Boy, you're really giving Herbert a hard time here. You really don't you think you're really going soft on Bernstein? Don't you think you really need?" And it was so funny. And what I noticed when we did readings in New York City, folks said, "I think you kind of gave Herbert the white hat and Lenny the black hat in this." And I said, "You can't make everybody happy. It's everybody brings to it." But yeah, I could see why you say that because I tried to the extent possible to make them both sympathetic characters. Um,
They were, but they were also difficult characters. And again, we're not giving stuff
yeah.
away here. I don't want to, but there were many points in the play where they found commonality on things that they cared about,
Yeah.
and um, and those were interesting scenes because you allowed them to express aesthetic judgments, personal issues. I'm not. I don't want to give it away. I want people to see the play.
Hmm.
But it was very interesting for that because they were revealed as two very brilliant, complex, vain, old men with bladder issues, and which in one case prevented him from conducting much anymore
Yep.
and not conducting long pieces because of
Yeah.
the bladder issues. Um, and to hear these two men talk about toileting, and you think, my God, this is Herbert von Karajan and Leonard Bernstein, and they're talking about having to pee. But conductors, musicians, actors all deal with practicalities. They have to.
Great humanizers. Yeah.
They have to get the practicalities out of the way to do their art.
Hmm.
I will not mention who this is, but there was a very famous opera singer I worked with who many years
Hmm.
ago always put on absorbent underwear, whether she needed it or not. She was
Wow.
not having any problem, but she did it so that she didn't have to think about it if she did have a problem.
Wow.
And so we always in the theater had to have a supply of absorbent underwear, and she would put on a pair and then discard them because unused, I mean
Yeah. Yeah.
unsullied, let's say. um, but that was how that gave her a sense of security to get to the stage.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then she moved to Broadway and did 7 shows a week in a couple of plays and musicals, and
Hmm.
they had an even bigger budget for absorbent underwear. She insisted that that's how she would perform, and I think one of them she was directed by Hal Prince, now that we're talking about it, but anyway,
Hmm.
maybe you and I will discuss after who that was. But it's very important. I mean, I found it very humanizing in a way
Hmm.
that these two characters could be talking about all the great issues of the world and their two brilliant careers. They were talking about how do you deal with toileting if you
Yeah.
have to go and stand on a podium for 90 minutes leading a Mahler symphony. And
And it's funny. One critic in New York actually really had a problem with that, saying that Mr. Danish focused on banalities. Is this really what these two great geniuses would have spoken about?
Yeah.
I said, you know, do you remember that scene in Amadeus when Mozart says we talk about these people like they marble? Okay. That's kind of the whole thing. I didn't want these to be two icons on pedestals. These, at the end of the day, were two very real flesh and blood people. Um, and I met Bernstein one time, and it was at a thing called A Taste of Manhattan back in the mid '80s. Do you remember that thing they used to do it? Uh, they did it at Roseland. My first job out of college was working for the New York Times restaurant guide
Ah.
when we used to have a restaurant guide called Manhattan Menus. Remember that from years and
Yes,
years
for
ago?
sure.
And I worked on that. And the Taste of Manhattan was this wonderful event where all the best restaurants would go to, they did it at Roseland, they did it at other places, and they had like a little booth. And they could have a couple of things that you'd spend your big cash to get into the thing. And you could take a sampling from Lutèce and La Côte Basque and Le Cirque and all these wonderful, wonderful restaurants. And uh, I was a copywriter, a novice at the time, very young, and Leonard Bernstein walked in with two fellas, uh, and basically took off his cape. He had the cape at the time, I got Kusevitsky's,
Always had the pick, yeah.
and tossed it to one of his fellas, who tossed it to me. What am I supposed to do with this? And the guy turned to me and said, "Is there a coat check?" I said, "Yeah, I'll get it. I'll find you." And I went and got a coat check for that's like my only connection to Leonard was I got a coat check for his cape in like 1985 or 86. Karajan I never met, but I did see him once. I saw one of his final, I guess he did two performances in '88 earlier, just the same time as the play at Carnegie. And I saw him do the Bruckner 8, which I mentioned in the play. And as you say, I don't know if you were in attendance at any of those shows. I thought when he came out the door, the little door, stage right in Carnegie, it was almost like there was a collective gasp in the audience, like we were seeing Moses, you know? And he came out and he was not very tall.
No.
And he moved. I mean, he had very bad back, very bad legs, had several strokes. He moved really slowly out to the podium. And you had that moment you said, is he going to make it? Is he going to get through? This is a long symphony. Um, and he got to the podium and he stopped. He put his hand on the bar there, and I think he was catching his breath, but he looked at the audience and nodded to like acknowledge their applause. And then he climbed up and he stood there and waited for the applause to die down, and waited and waited. Must have been, I mean, it felt like forever, but it was probably 20, 30 seconds. He wanted dead silence in the room before he gave the downbeat. And the minute he gave the downbeat, you got goosebumps. The music screamed at you. It was so wonderful. And I said, wow, I've heard this before, but never like this. This is really something special. And I'm not going to say we're not in a golden age right now of conductors. Every age is what it is. But there were a couple of performances I heard. One was the Karajan, one was Tenstead once, one was Schulte. And they were just, the hairs on the back of your neck stood up and didn't stop for the entire length of the performance. You don't
What
get
did
that a lot,
Tenstead
right?
conduct? I think of him as the most underappreciated conductor of that era, Klaus Tenstead.
Yeah. I
I
mean,
once heard him. I worked on a production. He conducted Electra. It was extraordinary. I'm getting
yeah,
goosebumps now as I think of it.
he left blood on the podium.
Yeah, Klaus Tenstead was, and his Beethoven, his Fidelio was
Mhm.
phenomenal.
That was, yeah.
Oh,
And I think about that because, and it wasn't that they were out of control, wild, passionate. They were under control, wild, passionate. And they were a river of energy to their players. And I remember asking Jerry again, who played with Tenstedt only one time. He said he was unbelievable. He said he looked at you and you felt the energy build up inside you. He said that that was so rare. And I think about right now, and I don't know. I don't want to say what's missing, what's lacking, what's because I think there's a lot of fine conductors out there. But I have not had, just purely in terms of quantity, the same amount of electrifying performances that I used to have years ago. Maybe
I
I'm getting old and
have.
crotchety.
No, I have, but I think that the conductor as God thing has been put behind us for the most part,
Mhm.
except for Riccardo Muti and maybe one or two others, um, who are from an older era. But the younger conductors, by younger I mean also in their 60s,
Mhm.
can be perceived as colleagues, first among equals kind
Yeah.
of thing. That was the Abato approach,
Yeah.
as opposed to the Muti approach. Because I, having lived in Italy and worked in Italy, you were either a Muti or an Abato. I felt one could be both,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
I definitely was trained by Abato and learned from Abato. So Muti was I was experiencing something different. But Abato was first among equals. So
Mhm.
someone like Fabio Luisi or John Andrea Nozeta has that approach of first among equals, even if, especially Nozeta, has drawn a lot in his knowledge from Riccardo Muti and also Valery Gergiev. And you
Mhm.
can feel those conductors. Nozeta is his own man and he's doing wonderful work,
Mhm.
but you can feel the presence of Nozeta growing up in Milan, hearing Abato,
Yeah.
hearing Muti, and then studying with Gergiev in Siena and then in Russia. Um, you can feel that in a different way than, say, Sir Colin Davis, who could do electrifying performances, but was steely and British. I love the
Mhm.
work of Sir Donald Runnicles, a
Mhm.
Scottish
Oh,
conductor who performs a lot in
yes.
Berlin and San Francisco. Fantastic conductor.
He came
But
to the Met, was it last year or 2 years ago for the first time in years?
for
And
Tannhäuser,
yeah,
I think it was
and
extraordinary. Yeah. I heard him conduct Hansel and
oh,
Gretel. It was extraordinary. So
yeah,
there are these great
marvelous.
conductors today, definitely,
Yeah.
but the mythology around them and the media around them are very different. But I
I
hear
went to see
great.
Muti. I saw Muti at Carnegie with the Vienna a few months ago.
Mhm.
And something I was seated very close but on the side. So I got a very profiled look at him. And something surprised me that 20, 30 years ago I didn't see from him. Um the economy of movement. He would just look, and the hands, very little movement. Very little movement. I don't think he pointed to a section all night. He would look in the general direction and give a brief nod, but he didn't. Um, and I'll tell you, I won't mention names, but I went to the New Jersey Symphony a few nights later, and the maestra, that night was literally jumping up and down and pointing at everyone.
She
And
does. I know who you mean, but she's a lot younger too.
yeah, but I also had that moment of it was so ostentatious. And I know a couple of the players. And I said, does this person want to draw the attention to themselves? And the player said, no, not really. Um,
She's
that's
also very short.
yes.
And I think that contributes to it. Muti is of a
that's
certain height
that
and
is
can
possible.
stand there
Yeah.
and be seen.
Yeah.
She's very, very short. So therefore, um,
But she's
maybe
making quite
she
a
has to
career
do
for
different
herself.
things to get across. I love her work. I once saw her work with the youth orchestra at Carnegie
I'm
Hall,
very impressed
and
with
she
her
was
work.
dynamic,
Yeah. Yeah.
and she's conducted at the Met, so she's good. But different because not because of her
Mhm.
gender, but more of her height and maybe her
Yeah.
age.
Yeah.
Muti is 80-ish, I would think.
He's
And there,
80. Yeah. He's
yeah.
80.
So therefore he doesn't need to jump around as much.
Hmm.
Herbert Blomstedt is 98 or 96, whatever he is. and
Yeah.
he uses economy of gesture.
Yeah.
Bernard Haitink was economical. As they get older, it's okay. They don't have to flail about. Schulte remained very energetic,
Yeah.
but he died, I think, at the age of 84. And in a
The
way, I
last time I
was
saw him, he conducted a youth symphony at Carnegie right before he passed. I forgot even who the youth symphony was, but I remember they did the Meistersinger overture. And he's 83 years old. He's like a Mexican jumping bean,
yeah.
he's all over the place. And it was wonderful to see um that he still had that same energy at that point. And it was clear, you could see the smiles on the kids' faces, that
Hmm.
I'm sure they didn't know him except by legend and watching videos of him, with Birgit Nielsen and the horse.
Vienna recording Gott Zammerung.
Yeah, and you saw what he was like. That's 60 years ago. And
Yeah,
60 years later, he's still got that same energy. It was wonderful to see.
opera. Well,
Yeah.
you bring back a memory for me. Um, I lived in Italy for many years. I had an apartment in the province of Genoa. I won't say what town, but a little
Hmm.
town 23 kilometers southeast of Genoa.
Hmm.
And other conductor families, including the Luisis and the Chayes, lived in that town. I
Hmm.
didn't know them then. And I knew the Chayes, but not the Luisis. And it was while I was there that Princess Diana died in Paris.
Mm.
And Liguria, the Italian Riviera, is Riviera dei Fiori. It's where the flowers grow.
Yep.
And all the flowers that would have been grown and sold all over the world were basically cut and sent to London for the memorial of Princess Diana.
Hmm.
Um, a few days later, Mother Teresa died in Calcutta, and Italy and the Catholic Church and people all around the world were observing that after Diana. A few days after that, in Italy, down the road from me, George Schulte died, and no one
Mm.
noticed. And to me, that was, I mean, I'm sorry for Diana, I'm sorry for Mother Teresa, but no
Yeah.
one noticed that George Schulte died
Yeah. The
at that
timing was
time.
bad.
And it was so, you know, I'm sorry when any of these figures go, especially
Yeah.
Diana, who was killed. It was not like Mother Teresa living a long, productive life.
Yeah.
Um, but Schulte died. It barely got a notice.
Yeah.
It's kind of like Prokofiev and Stalin died on March 5th, 1953, or March 3rd, I forget.
Yeah.
And they died on the same day. No one noticed Prokofiev.
Prokofiev.
Stalin died.
There was
So,
another wonderful conductor from La Spezia, um, Eduardo Müller. Do you remember Maestro
sure.
Müller?
Yeah, sure.
Marvelous, wonderful one. He was a friend of my family, actually. And I loved him deeply. And he said, somehow Levine, he says, Jimmy thinks I can only conduct bel canto.
I know.
and and he got roped into doing all the bel canto stuff for decades.
Yep.
And then he finally said no more, and he moved out to San Diego, where they
Yep.
gave him like everything, and he
Everything.
was just as
Yep.
happy to do it. Uh, I have a
La
great line
Spezia,
for
by
you
the way,
about
is the
that.
town where Wagner began writing The Ring. You know that.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. I don't know. That area, the Cinque Terre,
Sibelius,
Liguria, Santa
Tchaikovsky,
Margherita, all
all of them.
those wonderful towns. The food is phenomenal. The water is beautiful. The people are beautiful. It's like, why would you ever want to leave?
Tell me about it. I wrote a whole book about it called Recipes from Paradise about life and food on the Italian Riviera. It's of my
I
books,
got
it's
I
my
got to find
favorite
that
book.
one.
And
Yeah,
it's
that's
it's about that part of the world and about the particular strangeness and peculiarity of the people whom I love.
hmm
But Verdi loved that area.
yeah.
Verdi felt more at home there than he did in Milan or Parma. Um,
hmm hmm
and Sibelius wrote down the road from where I lived. And Edward Elgar wrote Symphony of the South in Liguria. Tchaikovsky spent a lot of time there,
Yep.
and very, very inspiring place.
You
Gorgeous.
just brought up something incredible, okay? Because I remember there used to be my ex-wife was an opera singer, and she used to go to uh, uh, one of these master classes that they did down there. I think it was in Santa Margarita every year.
Mhm.
And I remember one year it was, you'll love these names. It was Capuccilli was there, and Ferruccio Tagliavini, right before he died,
Yep. Yep.
was there. It was like, oh my God. And I will tell you, when we're at the thing and I'm reading the program that they have there, they said Tchaikovsky began his Winter Symphony here,
Mhm.
and Sibelius began his Symphony Number 4 here. I'm like, why are they writing these dark gray sad symphonies in
Yep.
this most beautiful place in the world? what
Yep.
what sort of mind would think about dark clouds and fog when they're looking out at the sea of Liguria? You
Because they're
know?
thinking I have to go back up to Norway or Finland or Russia, and where it's dark all
Yeah.
winter. And
Oh God.
um, Renata
But I thought that was
Sibaldi
so
lived there when
fascinating.
she died. Her last years were in Liguria. Yeah, it's
Mm,
rather remarkable. Renata Scolto is from there.
hmm.
Um, it's a remarkable place. That is
Yeah.
the Teatro Carlo Felice in Genova is a great opera house, and yeah,
Mhm.
it's
Yeah.
there's nothing like Italy, and I love all the other countries. Austria, I adore, but
Yeah.
there's really
There's
nothing
something
like it.
special. Yeah.
Uh,
Mm.
and that's why everybody went there. They complain about it, but if you complain, then get out. That's my view. If you don't like it, you can leave.
Yeah.
Um, so your play has two performers, and I've been using the word performers and actors
Hmm.
and people who played
Yes,
the role. Um, they're women playing these two
that is
characters.
correct.
How did that come to pass?
It's a very interesting story also because it began. This is crazy. I'm going to try and make it very short because we could be here all day just talking about this. The first draft of the play was completed in 2020, and we were going to do it at the Sheen Center downtown on 3rd Street in Manhattan. And we had sold out the entire run, small theater, it was only 99 seats. And it was going to run in June and July of 2020. Well, of course,
Ah,
the pandemic put the kibosh on that. So it was canceled. Uh, and that theater company went out of business. And so it started to flounder. My agent in London, a wonderful, wonderful agent named Jean Diamond. Jean has represented everyone from Yul Brenner to her current crop, her current crop of kids, Charlotte Rambling and Liv Ullman.
wow.
Okay, kids. So she said to me,
Did you hear my heart go pitter pat about Lee
eh,
Ullman? Charlotte
right?
Rampling's great, but Lee Ullman.
Yeah.
Wow.
So Jean says to me, they're good friends of hers. They've been her clients for 40 years. She said they're best friends and they've never worked together.
Ah,
And in 60 years of careers, they have never worked together and they'd like to do something on stage together. And she said, do you have anything similar to that play that you wrote about Bernstein? Something like that, that's a very talky, uh, kind of conventional, but intelligent dialogue type play for two women. I said, yeah, it's called Last Call. Okay. And she said, what do you mean? I said, how unbelievable would it be to have Lee Ullman and Charlotte Rambling playing Bernstein and Carrion? And she said, that's crazy.
who played which one?
Well, we hadn't decided. I figured Lee Ullman would be Carrion, but who cares? You
Yeah,
know, simply because she does have an accent, and I thought that might be natural. And I said, Gene, think of the publicity we would get if that ran in the West End.
yeah.
Okay, okay. And she says, well, I will. I'm going to have lunch with them, and we can talk about it. So she sat down, had lunch with them, talked about it. They took a quick look at the play. They liked it, which was the good news. but they said this is not what we want to be our final roles. If this is going to be our last time on stage, perhaps a pants role is not what we want.
Mm.
So I had to respect that. And then I had written, one of my best pals is the conductor of the Athens Philharmonic and the Cyprus Philharmonic, a guy named Yanis Hadjiloizou, marvelous conductor. His hero is Dimitri Mitropoulos,
Mhm.
with good reason.
Yeah.
Okay.
Conductor, just so people know.
Yeah, Dimitri Mitropoulos, the famous Greek conductor who was the conductor of the New York Phil for any number of years there, and very closely associated with Leonard Bernstein, was one of his mentors and then a competitor. And um, Giannis said to me, I want to commission from you a one-man show on the life of Dimitri Mitropoulos. And I said, okay, let's sit down and talk about it. And then it dawns on me, Giannis is like 6'2", bald, Greek. He's a conductor. I said, he's perfect. It writes itself. And as I was doing the homework, I didn't realize, shame on me, that Mitropoulos died on stage at La Scala.
Yep.
Conducting Mahler 3.
Yep.
So there's this whole lore about that. And as I was doing the homework, something clicked in my head. Mahler 3 has a mezzo soprano or an alto in it. I wonder who the alto was. And I looked online and I couldn't find it. In fact, I couldn't find a program for that performance anywhere. And I'm pretty good at research. And it was starting to drive me crazy, like a thorn in my shoe,
Mhm.
And I started calling friends. I have a friend, Roberto, who's a DJ in Rome, classical DJ. And I put him on the scent. He loves these kind of things, playing detective on these things. And he calls me a week later, says, I have no idea. It's like the performance never took place, but it had to take place because it's in all the history books. So we had this mystery. Okay. I have an Italian agent. Her name is Ambra Sorrentino. Ambra is from down in Naples. She was a harpist with the Gewandhaus Orchestra years and years ago. Now she runs a company called Opera Copro. It's a little bit of a tangent, but she had the brilliant idea that most opera companies keep 80 to 90% of their productions in storage at any given time. And she and her team cataloged the storages of about 30 or 40 opera companies, put them in a catalog, put it
Mhm.
online, and you could become a member of this co-op, and they trade productions. Brilliant idea.
Yep.
So she's so connected in that world still. I told her the story, and she said, that's fascinating. She said, I have an ex-boyfriend who I think his grandfather was the La Scala archivist back then. Really? They have an archivist? Well, of course they do. Why didn't
Yep.
I think of that? I said I went to the La Scala site and it's not on their site. The show is not, the performance is not there. She says, that's interesting. Let me call him. She calls him, calls me back and says, he has no idea, but he remembers when it happened. He was working there at the time. It was big news when
Yeah.
he died. So she tells me I'm going to ask him if he can go into the archives himself and try and find something. Well, the guy's in his 90s. Okay, so he says he doesn't want to do it.
Come out.
Yeah, so my friend the DJ managed to get up there and do it. And he said to me, I figured out why it's not in the records. And I was like, Columbo and Sherlock Holmes combined. Why? He said, he died in the afternoon during the dress rehearsal.
Ah,
They never did the performance.
ah,
I said, that can't be. It says he died on stage conduct. Oh,
yeah.
so the performance was canceled because he died that afternoon.
But they still
So
would have had a mezzo scheduled.
it should have been in there, right? So the old guy said to us, well, there has to be a printed program somewhere. If he if he died that afternoon, they
Yeah.
printed the program.
Yep.
So he said there are physical archives. He goes, they're not in the building anymore. They're in a separate place. And they went and found it. And he calls me back and says, it was an American mezzo soprano named Lucretia West. And I said, never heard of her.
Bye.
I said, what was an American? And then he says to me, and here's the best part, she's black.
I love it. Wonderful.
I said, wait a minute, wait a minute. This is 1960. When did Leontine Price sing there?
No, but there were black artists singing in Milan before that. Charlotte Holloman. There were various ones. Yeah.
Yes.
That's not,
So
thankfully they were ahead of us on,
they were,
you know.
and it was interesting to me that they made a very big deal out of
Good.
Leontine's thing there, like it cracked the color barrier. It really
No, no.
didn't. They had several singers there prior to her. So I looked up this person and said, "Oh my goodness, look at this person's life. She was born in Virginia, rural Virginia, got a grant, an Eisenhower grant to go study in Germany. And why is she in La Scala with Dmitri Mitropoulos? What is the connection?" So I called a buddy of mine who works in the State Department because they know everything.
Yep.
And I won't say his name because I don't want to get him in trouble.
Yeah.
He did a little homework for me and said, okay, she did leave America at such and such a time. She was a grant. He said, but I can see from her passport coming and going in the United States, she left the United States, returned once in the late 50s, then went back to Germany, came back in 2003, and it doesn't look like she ever left. So I said, okay, so she died here. Let me look up the obituary. Fred, there was no obituary. Couldn't find it. I called my friend again and he said, there is no obituary. He said, but I got better. I have an address for her and a phone number. I said, how old is she? He says, it looks like she's 100 years old.
Wow.
Wow. So he gave me the number. I called it, no answer. I called it again, no answer. I kept calling it, no answer. And I'm thinking all the worst things. This poor woman has passed away on a couch and no one knows she's. So finally, I call Ann Midgett down in Washington and I
Music
tell Ann the
critic for the
story.
Washington Post. Yep.
And Ann Midgett, yes, former New York critic, moved to Washington, wonderful writer for the Washington Post. She's also working on a book about African American opera singers and their history. So I thought this would be of particular interest for her. And she was fascinated by it. And I told her the address, and she goes, Pete, that's like very close to my house. She goes, I could literally drive over there. I said, will you go and knock on the door? Because I want to make sure she's okay. She says, no, no, no. But why don't you come down here? I said, all right, I'm willing to do this. I'll hop on the train and go down there. So the next day I try her one last time. Just why not? And someone answers the phone. And the woman answers the phone, says to me, who is this? And why are you calling? Are you one of them robocallers? I said, no, I'm not a robocaller. I said, I'm not a robocaller, ma'am. I said, is this Miss West? She says, who is this? I said, this is Peter Danish. I'm a writer from New York City. She goes, uh-huh. I said, I'm writing a story about Maestro Dimitri Metropolis? And she says, who? I said, Dimitri Metropolis. And she says, say that again. She goes, Dimitri Metropolis. And a voice in the distance says, is that Maestro Metropolis on the
Oh.
phone? Oh my God. And she says, here, you talk to her. Okay. Someone comes on the phone and goes, is this Maestro Metropolis? Oh my God, Maestro, how have you been? I haven't heard from you in so long. Oh my God, how are you doing? It's so good to hear your voice.
Go.
I said, Miss West, it's not Maestro Metropolis. I'm so sorry. She goes, why did you say you were Maestro Metropolis? I said, that's a cruel joke to play. I said, no, no, no. I said, the girl who answered the phone, I told her I'm a writer from New York. And I'm writing a story about Maestro Metropolis. And she's, oh, okay. She goes, I knew him very well, you know. I said, yes, that's why I'm reaching out to you. I said, who was it that answered the phone? And she says, ready for this? I have no idea, but she lives here and I don't know who she is. It's like, oh my
Oh,
God. She's got dementia.
yeah.
She doesn't know who her caregiver is.
Oh.
So I said, okay, I'm sure she's all right. She never leaves. She sleeps here. So I said to her, um, Ms. West, I'm writing a story and hopefully a play about Maestro Metropolis. She goes, well, isn't that a wonderful idea? He was the most beautiful man I ever met in my whole life. He was my guardian angel.
Huh.
What do you mean? She says, oh my goodness, when I was living in uh, Krunher, I forgot the name of the town, Germantown near the western border.
Mhm.
Uh, forgive me for not remembering the name. Uh, in those days, there were no, and this is a great story. She says, in those days, Europeans had never heard American spirituals. There were no records.
Right.
She said it was only when American, and she said, she used to say, she said, colored girls.
Yeah.
She said, when colored girls came from America to Europe, they would sometimes do spirituals. And she said, the Europeans loved them,
Mm.
loved them. I said, that's really, really cool. She says, and I spoke perfect German.
Ah.
So I developed a little bit of a reputation around my part of the country as a pretty good Schubert and Schumann recitalist.
Mhm.
I said, that is so wonderful. She says,
Mhm.
I didn't do much opera, but I did do a lot of recitals. And she says, let me tell you, if Jesus Christ himself had walked out on stage, them Germans, them whitey white Germans, could not have been more shocked that when I walked out and they saw I was black, they thought I was Lucrezia Weist. So she said she was doing quite a bit of
Happy Good
recitals.
Friday.
Yeah, exactly. So she said I was doing all these recitals and I started to realize there were a lot of girls that could sing terrific Schubert and Schumann, but there was no one that could sing the spirituals like me. So I started doing spiritual concerts. She says, and one day I was doing a concert, and after the concert was over, I'm going to have to grab a tissue for this one because it's going to make me cry. She's after the concert was over, the intendant came, and this was in some little theater, nothing fancy. He said, Maestro Dimitri Metropolis is in the audience and he would like to meet you.
Oh.
And I thought they were pulling my leg. Why would Dimitri Metropolis of the New York Philharmonic want to come see little old me? And she said, he burst through the door with like 3 dozen roses
Well,
and he shut the door. And she said, I got scared. I said, please open the door. And he said, I need to talk to you. She said, please open the door. It's not proper for me to be alone with a man in my dressing room. And he said, "Oh, all right, all right, all right." So he opens the door a crack. And she said she was nervous. So he put the roses on her dressing table and got down on his knees in front of her and said to her, "Ms. West, you are a miracle.
Mm.
You've done something for me. You have given me a gift that few people could ever bestow." And she's like, "Will you please get off your knees? This doesn't look right. Please, please, please get up." And he took her hands and he said, "You may not know this about me, but I studied for the priesthood until I was almost in my 20s, and I was either going to become a priest or a musician. And I elected to serve God through my music." She says, "That's wonderful." He said, "The Greek Orthodox view of God is kind of an angry, strict God, a
Right.
fire and brimstone God. When I watched you sing those spirituals, I knew in my heart that you knew in your heart that God loved you." He says, "I've never known that."
Wow.
Wow.
Mm.
And she said, he started to cry and I started to cry and we hugged each other. And she said, "I fell in love with him at that moment."
Mm.
He said, "I would like you to come and sing with my orchestra." She's like, "Are you kidding? I just do little." He said, "I want you to come sing with me." And he invited her to sing on a whole bunch of gigs, whatever she wanted. And he said, "All I ask is that for encores, we do spirituals and
Mm.
you let me accompany you on the piano." And they did. And he
Wow.
accompanied her on piano. After they did this small tour, he said to her, "If you could have anything in the world artistically, your druthers, what would it be?" She says, "I sure would like just once to sing at Carnegie Hall." The next season, he brought her as soloist with the New York Philharmonic to Carnegie Hall. She said to me, "That man gave me Carnegie Hall." She said, "I had no life before meeting this man.
Mm.
I would go to war. I would kill and die for this man. He was that good a man." I said, "Wow." She said, "The day he died, I died. It really, really ripped me apart." She said, "The night before, we were in Cologne, Germany." And Fred, this is like so wonderful because she couldn't tell me, what day it was. But
Oh yeah,
the further back the story went, the more clear the memories were. That's fairly common, I guess,
with
with this. I
dementia,
went through it with
absolutely.
my mom. It
Yeah.
was a really tough thing, but I'm recognizing this, that the deeper I went, the more vivid her memories were. And she said, "The night before, we were in Cologne, Germany, doing a concert." And she says, "What's the funny thing?" She's, "We did a recording of that concert, and it was the same program, the Mahler 3." And I said, and I ran to my collection. I have the damn CD
Wow.
of the Cologne concert with the Cologne Radio Orchestra. I go, "Oh my goodness, I have your recording." And I had it for 30 years. I haven't put it on in ages. I haven't put it on in ages. And she said to me, after the concert, we had to take a night train down to
Oh,
Italy. She says, "It was no fun taking an
no.
overnight train down." She said it was like 10, 12 hours down to Milan. And then she said, "In Milan, the people were pigs."
Mm.
I said, "What do you mean?" She says, "When I got off the train, no porter would pick up my bag." And now it suddenly becomes this, I don't want to say cliched because there's a reason we said before why things become cliches. She said, I asked 5 different boys to pick up my bags and they just walked by me. They walked by. It wasn't until the maestro got off the train and he demanded that they take my stuff. She says, we had to do the same to get a taxi cab. She says, when we got to La Scala, she said, I just stood in front of it and looked at it and said, I cannot believe I am here.
Yeah.
I cannot believe I am here. And they started to walk through the front door, and the usher told them, hold on. Can I see some identification? Who are you? And he said, we'd really prefer if you guys went in through the side door, the gallery door, or around. And Metropolis said, if we don't walk through right now, there's not going to be a performance tonight. They didn't recognize him. And they were a biracial couple in 1960, kind of,
Yeah.
in Milan. So she was nervous. And they went in. She said during rehearsal, we had a big suite backstage with food and Coca-Cola, and it was wonderful. She says, I grabbed a wooden chair, I pulled it on stage, and I sat there the whole time. And the maestro said, dear, wouldn't you rather sit in the back and relax? You don't come in until the 5th movement. It's a good hour. And she said, maestro, I am not leaving your side. I'm afraid if I leave the stage, they ain't never going to let me back.
Okay.
And she said, but when I was at his side, I knew nothing would ever go wrong because he would not let it happen. And I'm like, this is the sweetest story of all time. So I said to her, Ms. West, would you mind if I included you in my play? Because your story is so wonderful. And she goes, well, you better.
Did you actually get to meet her?
Well, there's the punchline.
Yeah.
I called my buddy Giannis and the director in Piraeus who wanted to do the play, and I said, I have good news and bad news. I said the good news is the play is getting better every day. The bad news, it's no longer a one-man show.
Yeah.
And when I told him what it was about, he was okay with it. So I called Anne Midget and told her, you won't believe this. I spent 2 hours on the phone with this lady. She's sharp as a tack, so long as we don't come past 1970. Okay. And I have 5 pages of handwritten notes from the conversation. And I said to her, would you mind terribly if I came down with a camera crew and interviewed you? And she says, well, I got to ask the girl, her kid, because she don't like nobody coming in the house. And I said, okay, I understand. I understand. And she put her on the phone. And I think this was her niece, if I understood her correctly. And she said, oh, you don't want to do that. I said, no, 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 we'd love to. She goes, no, no, she's not well. And the house is a disaster. You don't want to, you really, and she says, I don't have the time or the energy to get it cleaned up I said, no, we don't care. She says, no, no, you don't understand. Ms. West is a very proud woman. Okay. And you would not be making her happy if you released any kind of images of her in her current state. I said, okay, I have to respect that. I said, do you think we can maybe take some pictures, if not video? Could we? She says, well, why don't we talk next week and we can set up another interview? I asked her if she knows how to do a Zoom call. No.
Yes.
And long story short, I called Anne and said, Anne, I'm going to come down and we're going to interview her. Where they don't really want pictures because she's not well. And she's very, very proud and doesn't want, I said, and Anne got it too. She understood. And like 2 days later, she called. Ms. West passed away at 100.
Yeah.
This is February of 2 years ago.
Wow.
Unbelievable. Just
Yeah.
unbelievable. So she said to me, the nice thing she said was, young man, I love being called young man.
I
Don't
do
you?
too. I know.
I love it. She said, young man, I just want you to know that was the happiest I've seen her in decades.
Oh,
And that made me feel great. So she said, Miss West said she hopes you dedicate the play to her. So of course, when we
of
eventually get
course.
around to doing it, um, we're going to dedicate it to her. So here's the funny thing. Uh, I brought it to Denise Graves for her
Oh,
foundation that does all of these things. And we're talking about her, the Graves Foundation does all these things about unknown or
Denise Grace
forgotten.
being a wonderful African American mezzo soprano from Washington, D.C.,
Yeah.
who made her name as Carmen, but has done so much more than just that. Wonderful Carmen, though she is. She's done all kinds of roles. She, I've had many singers of African descent describe Denise Graves as the person sort of after the Leontine Martina Grace Shirley generation
Mm-hmm.
and before some of the younger Black artists. There was a period where it was really just Denise Graves among the
Yeah.
major stars, and how many of our younger ones, like Angel Blue, and not only, were
Mm-hmm.
influenced by Denise Graves.
Sure.
They revered Mother Price, as she was called, and Martina, who they studied with, and so
Mm-hmm.
on, and Shirley Verrett and Grace Bunbury, and more. Um,
And my favorite of
Kathleen
them
Battle
all,
and Jesse
Leona
Norman were
Mitchell.
sort of in
Leona
that
Mitchell.
generation a little later, but then came Denise Graves, and then came a whole wonderful generation of younger Black
Yeah.
artists. But Denise, for a while, was kind of it.
Yeah.
And she was a heroine, and she, like Leontine and I have known both, um, understood their role and never abused it. They understood that they represented hope and possibility for younger artists, especially Black artists, and they they didn't work it, so to speak. They acknowledged that they were doing that too, in addition to their music making, that they represented hope, and if you could see it, you could be it, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And so Denise Graves has created a magnificent foundation. She was on this program about 4 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and she's great. So I think she'd be wonderful to play Lucretia West.
Well, I'll tell you, here's the funny thing about that. Um, I went to see recently, a couple months ago, Leona Mitchell did a
Hmm.
concert in New York. I hadn't seen her in 30 years. She
Yep.
sounded marvelous.
Yes, I know.
Um, and I chit-chatted with her afterwards and we exchanged contacts. And I mentioned to her the play. And she said, oh, would you send it to me? I said, surely, I'd love you to. She had never heard of Lucretia West. Neither had Denise. Um, neither had Janae Bridges. Neither had as I was talking to all the African American stars of today. Um, and she read it and said, okay, here's what you need to do. Suddenly, Leona's a dramaturge. She said, I think Denise would be fantastic if she wants to do this. But I think your story of how you found Lucretia
Yes.
is as interesting as the day he died. And maybe you could bookend the play with elder Lucretia talking to Peter, flashback to 1960, and she says, and I would just love to play elderly. so so Leona is interested in it. Great, the thing. Denise has like 5 million things on her plate with this foundation. They've got stuff, and she's still singing.
Yeah.
So she's got so much on her plate that I got to really sit down and nail her down for some time because we wanted to do as a reading in New York with the two of them and see how it went. And I thought with the two of them it would be just magical, to
There's
be
another
honest with
thing I
you.
want to say about Denise Graves. And I love
Hmm.
Leona Mitchell. I got to work with her a lot, actually, because her years, her glory years at the Met overlap with my
Hmm.
working years. So we did Ernani. There were all kinds of things. And Aida, she was a big star in that period, wonderful artist and lovely person. Um, but what I'm about to say about Denise Graves is not versus Leona, it's versus every other opera singer.
Uh-huh.
Denise Graves has a wonderful speaking voice
Oh
in
goodness, does she?
addition to her singing voice.
Yeah.
Many opera singers have good, nice,
Hmm.
resonant speaking voices, but Denise Graves' speaking voice is really special,
Yes.
really atmospheric. And she's from DC, and Lucretia West was from there. If you want to work in both Devon Tynes and Ryan Speedo Green, they're both Virginians.
Yeah. And
And
marvelous.
yeah, so
Yeah.
we have the whole story going now.
So how this all comes back to Last Call.
Yeah. Yeah, I asked you a question about an hour ago. It's like talking to James Levine.
Sorry. My director was looking at this Dimitri Mitropoulos play, and he went to my website to see what else, because he didn't really know me when we first met. We had met casually and had become friendly, but didn't talk shop business. He went to my website and said, "Tell me about this play about Bernstein and Karajan." I said, "Well, it was supposed to happen in 2020. It didn't." And I gave him the short version. And he said, "I would love to direct that." I said, "Really?" I said, "But you do mostly musicals." He goes, "We'll put some music in it." I said, "No, there is some music in it
There
already."
is. Yeah.
And he said, "I just found he said, I haven't read a word of the dialogue yet. I just find the concept so fascinating." So we sat down, read through it together, and he said, "Give me like 90 days. Would you?" Okay. Came back to me and said, "The play as it stands is a bit conventional for me, and I would prefer, with your permission, if you let me make it a bit more impressionistic and a bit more of a magical reality, because no one knows what the men really spoke about.
Hmm.
And they're so fantastic. The characters are so gigantic. There's so much lore and mythology about them. I want to make it a bit grander than just a My Dinner with Andre type of story. Would you be okay with that?" I said, in principle, yes. Now let's talk turkey and tell me the concept." He goes, "I have two actors in mind who are two of the best actors in Germany. Phenomenal actors." Okay. "Helen Schneider and Luca Züchner." And I said, "Go on." I said, "I actually know who Helen Schneider is," I said to him. He says, I thought you might." I said, "She was like a rock star in the 70s, and she was
Yeah.
in this movie that I watched a lot when I was in like high school called Eddie and the Cruisers. She was the female singer, and she was Eddie's girlfriend in Eddie and the Cruisers. Big crush on her. Uh, and she moved to Germany after she did a play on Broadway called Ghetto in 1988, ironically, the same time, which I saw because a friend of mine was in the play with her. And it was a horrifying play, um, very hard to sit through. She got raped on stage every night in a very, very visceral fashion. I don't know how she did it. I don't know how she could do it every night. It was remarkable. And Frank Rich said it was the most anti-Semitic play he'd ever seen.
Frank Rich, having been for many years the chief theater critic for the New York Times, who then became, I think, a wonderful writer about politics and public
In
affairs.
fact, I'd say a better writer on politics than theater critic, because for him to dismiss a play because he believed it to be anti-Semitic, I thought was inappropriate, to be honest with you. But that was the kiss of death to the play. Um, People started protesting it and all kinds of craziness. Helen moved to Germany because she was asked by Andrew Lloyd Webber and Trevor Nunn to do the German premiere of Sunset Boulevard.
Uh,
She was a huge hit in Sunset Boulevard. Suddenly she's doing Anything Goes, Evita, Sally Bowles, Chicago.
Cabaret, yeah.
She became kind of the Patty LuPone of Germany, for want of a
Mhm.
better term, doing all the
Elaine
American.
Page of Germany.
Patty LuPone for you at home is a big American star who created the role of Evita on Broadway, Fantine in Les Mis, um,
Norma
and
Desmond in
Norma
London.
Des. Yeah, and essentially all of these
Anything
shows,
Goes.
anything goes. Yeah, at
Gypsy.
Lincoln Center. Yeah, and this was essentially what Helen became in Germany. She
Yeah.
became the principal lead. She was the most popular. Uh, and for you guys in Berlin, I'm sure you all know who she is. I don't have to tell you.
Did
Uh,
she ever do Hello Dolly?
I don't think she ever did Hello Dolly.
That's next.
I could, it may
I was
be
thinking that. I was thinking that when watching the
when you
play
were watching
and
her.
having read her credits, I was
Yeah,
thinking, well, maybe she didn't do Hello Dolly yet. She's ready now. She could be
she's
Dolly
ready
Guido.
now.
Auf Deutsch. Yeah.
And Luca, who plays Carrion, is this extremely well-regarded character actor.
Yeah.
Um, and when I first saw her, I said, she's young and beautiful. How is she possibly going to play Herbert von Karajan? And Gil, our director, said, trust me.
Yeah.
And when she came out in makeup and she transformed
You
into
really,
Karajan,
really did.
and I said,
Bad back, leaky bladder, the whole thing.
I said, is that her?
I know.
And she's unbelievable. I
Yeah.
really hope she gets a Drama Desk nomination because I haven't seen anything like her performance anywhere in
Yeah. It was
ages.
quite something. Yeah.
It's really something special. Yeah. And
Whereas Lenny is played, I'm not a critic here at all, but
yeah,
was more cosmopolitan.
yes. Yes, that's a good
Whereas
way of
the
putting
other
it.
one was a real deep dive into Kara and Psyche.
Yes. And also, Karyan's mannerisms,
Yeah.
you know, and because he did have them, he had his tweaks and his twitches and stuff, and both of them spent countless hours watching video of the men conducting, and it was really fun watching them. The part of the play that I won't mention it to anyone if they haven't seen it yet, where the two of them conduct the same piece at the same time, and you see vastly different ways of doing it. And there's a wonderful conductor named Eugene Cohn, who I'm sure you know
Old friend of
Eugene.
mine
Old
for decades.
Eugene came opening night, and he was crying. It was so sweet. He said, Peter, I don't know how you did this. He said, the women, or he said they were better than Bradley Cooper was in the movie.
Yeah.
We were laughing about this, but he said Luca understood Carrion is here between the shoulders,
Yeah.
and Lenny is the hands above the shoulders.
Right.
And when he said that to me, I spoke to the director about doing a juxtaposition of them in one scene,
Hmm.
and now it's in the play.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
not on opening night. It was something that we moved ever so slightly because of, thank you, Eugene,
Yeah.
for pointing out how well, without even knowing how well they had captured the essence of their vastly different conducting styles. And that
Now,
was a lot of fun to watch, to be honest with you, watching them
you and I
conduct.
have spoken a good long time, and I've loved it. We
Hmm.
don't have endless time, and there are a couple of things I'd like to cover. But one of the things I want to cover is, as I said to you at the very beginning, I see a very long life for this play.
Mm,
And having watched it with two German language actresses speaking in English, I would like to see this play in German.
yeah.
I sort of imagine that the play could be played in French and Italian and Spanish and Arabic and
Mhm.
Mandarin and Hindi and you name it. It's one of those plays where the subject matter is universal and it can be played in the vernacular of the country where it's being presented. But I think, frankly, the first one I'd like to see it in is German because the play had some German, was mostly in English, and
Mhm.
that was sort of advantage Bernstein because it was his language, even though it's set in Vienna. But
Mhm.
I would love to see it again, advantage Karian linguistically, because
Yeah.
Lenny spoke German, but it was not his mother tongue.
Hmm.
And hearing them talk about Nazi issues and so on in German would have a very powerful impact in a
Yes,
way that it couldn't to an English speaking audience watching in New York or wherever we would watch it in English.
totally
Have
agree.
you thought about that? Is that in the cards?
That is in the cards.
Okay.
We've had, you know,
Like the
it's
Burg
funny.
Theater in Vienna, frankly, was where I would do it. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just putting
We
that
we
out there.
we actually have
Mind trying
we've
to
had quite a few conversations already. I was astonished um to read in the first week. We had a review in London, we had a review in Zurich, we had a review in Austria, we had a review in Hamburg, we had a review in Cologne, we had a review in Budapest. And I didn't even know half of these journalists had come. And apparently, a lot of the papers have stringers that handle New York.
Yeah.
And the subject matter, I guess they considered it interesting enough. But I will tell you conclusively, uh, we've gotten raves all over the world, which I found very humbling, way better than we got in New York, where we had some decidedly mixed reviews about specifically about the women. It made me a little bit sad, but what can you do? Um, it made me sad how much ink people spilled on the fact that one actually said that, it's an insult to Bernstein's memory to have a woman portray him. And I was like, boy, misogyny is alive and well in the United States. That was very sad to hear that. Um, and
someone like Harriet Walter, has a British actress, has played many male roles. Diane Venora many years ago
yeah,
played Hamlet.
hmm
Vanessa
there's
Redgrave can
countless.
play
There's
whatever she
dozens.
wants. I
Yeah,
mean, no
yeah.
issue. It's
And it was,
only an issue if it doesn't ring true.
thank you.
So my guess would be that you would use the same actresses, I'll use that word, in the German language production.
That
But
would
I
be,
also can tell you, and this person's a friend of mine, full disclosure,
uh-huh.
I think the Martha Keller would be a fantastic Karian.
Martha Keller.
Would her
Wow.
German, it's her native
Yeah, yeah,
language.
of course.
She has directed opera. She has been part of the Verbier Festival for decades. She knows music intimately. She probably knew Kari, I know she knew Lenny.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, do I want her to be Lenny or Kari? And I
Where
think
does she live nowadays? She
I'll give
living
you the
in
contact
Switzerland?
information.
Because I thought she
I'll,
was
I'll
in
give I'll give you
Switzerland.
the contact information.
That'd be wonderful. Well, I know Uta
Sometimes
Lemper
I
came.
don't reveal this stuff, but
Uta Lemper
you,
came to see us the other night, and she
Udo
loved
Lemper.
it. She came to
Udo
see it.
Lemper could play Bernstein. Martha Keller could play Karian. There we go.
That's a thought as well. The
Yeah.
thing is that this particular production, because Gil Memert, our director, is such a popular director in Germany specifically, there's a lot of houses that would put on his production of this, you
Right.
know. Um, I will tell you, there are a couple of elements in the production that were 100% his idea, not mine. And you can probably use your imagination which ones they were. And he had to get my consent and agreement on them. And when I saw them, I said, "Oh my God, I love it." Now, some of those things also got us in trouble with some critics. Some of the crazier things in the show that we really, I felt that if we're going to do this as kind of an impressionistic thing, let's go all the way and let's make it.
So I'm not going to give anything away to the
Yeah,
listeners, but is it the turning of the bar?
that's one of them.
Okay.
um,
the bar the bar for listeners, the bartender is there. At a certain point, the bar gets turned around to reveal something else.
yes.
Yeah.
And in the first draft, that something else takes place off stage.
Okay.
Now it's in full view of the audience. And when I first thought about it, I said, do we really want to go there? And then I said, yeah, let's go there. Yeah. Um, because there's also, as you mentioned earlier, there's a certain honesty to that.
Yeah.
and I really wanted it to be about as honest a portrayal as
Yeah.
I could.
Yeah.
Uh, and look, nothing is for everyone. I've come to that conclusion. Um, I think we are asking our audiences to be a little bit adventurous with us,
Mhm.
um, because purists, I a fella on Facebook who's a conductor somewhere, um, sends me a message almost every single day telling me that I'm going to burn for this, and it makes me sad. You know, we've had, I think I mentioned this to you, we've had over a dozen members of the New York Phil have come to the play, and to a person, everyone has loved it,
Mhm.
loved it. They invited us to the Brahms first, which they did last week, and they invited the cast to come
Mhm.
uh, and meet the orchestra, and it was wonderful. We got photographs taken with them because those of you at home, the Brahms one plays an important role in the
That's
play.
indeed.
And Rebecca Young, who is the first violist, was there on opening night,
Mhm.
and she was going crazy. She was the youngest person ever to join the Philharmonic at like 22, right out of Juilliard,
Mhm.
and she played under Lenny for years and years and years. And she said, Peter, spot on.
There's an important thread in the play that I hope will entice more viewers to go, that or find it at a theater near you when it becomes an international play. Um, the fact that we meet Karian before we meet Bernstein, and Karian is studying the score for the Brahms first, and we discover through good stagecraft how it's in his head and he's experiencing it in his head, and then the interruption of the waiter who comes in and pulls him back to reality, and the sort of discourse that a waiter will do about we're not serving right now or whatever it is, or you have to wait for your coffee or your tea. No, it's tea. And then all Kari wants to do is get back to the Brahms first, which he's about to conduct for the 162nd time. And Bernstein, when he comes in, is mystified of how can anyone conduct the Brahms first 162 times. And with that, you very elegantly brought out their differences. Not that one is better than the other, but
Right.
that Bernstein, you know, did it and he did it, whereas Karian kept returning to it obsessively as if
Mhm.
there were still riches to plumb after 100,
Yes.
161 performances. Very interesting.
It's funny because I find myself, and I'm sure you do as well, uh, on my CD wall here, I have 8 Bohèmes. I have 8 Mahler 2s. I have, because I love it so much. And I
Mhm.
do think there is no one quintessential anything. And when people ask me about that, they said, oh, what's your favorite Mahler 2, for example? Okay. I said, well, the first movement I love by Karajan. The final movement I love by, and I'll go through the whole thing by, and literally movement by movement, I prefer.
Mhm.
Karajan for one, Schulte for another. The one that I always bring up is Schulte's recording of Bruckner 4, the Romantic.
Interesting. It's the only Bruckner recording I like of any Bruckner.
There you
Is that
go.
one.
His his
The
brass,
third movement. Yeah, I know.
his
That's why I like
brass
it.
is ferocious.
Yeah.
I
Chicago's
mean,
Limit, right?
it's
Yeah.
and the brass chorales in the middle of there,
Yep.
which are basically like slamming 6 notes together on the piano.
Right.
He brought out the individuality, and it just
Yep.
doesn't sound like mud like it does on almost every other recording. And he managed to find that articulation, and that's something that Schulte had. And I
That
don't
is
know
my
why.
favorite Bruckner recording of all.
And
Yeah.
so it's funny because,
Which
and
you
I
can hear
don't.
on Adagio, by the way.
I will listen to it. I'm a longtime member. I would say though that if you had to do the desert island disc type thing tonight, going to the symphony with my wife.
Oh, you went 3 days ago, I think you mean.
I know, I know. We're going again.
Okay.
We just go constantly. Well, because that's one of the things, guys.
Three days
I'm
ago,
the
I went to hear the Mahler Six.
I went to see that as well with the
Okay. I
Philadelphia
didn't see you
under
there.
Yannick. What I was going to say is that I'm the music editor for BroadwayWorld.com. Broadway World is not a scholarly site; it is a pop site, but it does get a heck of a lot of views.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I've used that for research for any number of things over the years, because it has enabled me to connect and interview a lot of artists. And I love picking the brains of them. You have spoken to quite a few. Your interview series is marvelous, and I find that more often than not, public personas are rarely who the people are, and that kind of comes back to Bernstein and Karajan in a way. That when there's a camera on you, like us right now, you're never really your 100% real self when there's a camera or anything you see on TV. And that's why I go back to the Bernstein letters, for example. When the camera's not on is when you're your real self. Uh, so going forward, I think I would love to bring the play all over Europe. I think Europe is the first choice. We have had a call from Korea
Yeah, I was going to say
about,
Japan, too.
yeah,
That part of the world too.
yeah,
Both
Korea.
were revered. Bernstein had a festival in Japan that he worked at. Yeah.
Yes, I know. Yeah. And I think that they would, I don't know if this production necessarily would work there. I'll give you, for example, Budapest said to us very plainly, no women. We would want to produce it, but we'd want to do it with two men. And I said, well, if you're producing it, it's your play. I have no difficulty with that. But for example, the German language houses that we've spoken to have all wanted to do this production there. And over time, I hope it gets a lot of productions and different directors and different ideas.
Martha Keller can also play it in French.
That's a good point.
Really? Yeah.
Well, I think at the end of the day, and I hope
And I'm
people
trying to
come.
think Isabelle Huppert for
Isabelle Hubert as Carion.
no, no,
Wow,
no.
you're good. But this is the point I was trying to make right now is that look at where we are in history right now. It's a really bizarre time. And what there's a thing at the end of the play, which when I wrote it was kind of a cautionary. I
Hmm.
won't say what it is. You know what I'm talking about. And it's no longer cautionary. It's our life now. And I had a beautiful chat with someone who was in the audience who was a Holocaust survivor. And she said to me, I think you went too easy on Karian. And I said, that's fair, you know. And she says, but I think what it boils down to, the play is not about Karian and Bernstein. She said, I think the play is a metaphor or an allegory for people coming together and trying to seek common ground. And I said, thank you.
In music.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I one of my day job, I'm a speechwriter for executives. And one of the things I frequently bring conductors to speak to Fortune 500 CEOs. And at first I was told, why in God's name would you do that? I said, because a conductor frequently has to herd cats and get 70 people from different backgrounds, often different languages,
Yeah.
so precise, okay, on the beat that you can't tell they're not apart. that's a skill to motivate people to be that together, to bring them
Yep.
together. And I love having conductors speak to business people because they have a completely different point of view than business people. And it's fun because conductors have different points.
Although I find in my experience of conductors speaking to business people, because I've spoken to a lot of business people, but
Mhm.
usually not the CEOs, but their young hires, whether
Uh-huh.
law firms or businesses, about getting cultured and how to bring culture into your working life and what the arts can bring you.
Mhm.
Um, that the conductors become a little too practiced and precious, and they're
Over
not as
time.
honest as they should be.
Yeah.
They have a spiel in a way. That's my experience. Um, other conductors are completely off the cuff and will say whatever they want, and that's
Sure.
okay too. I do want to point out a couple of things as we wind up that,
Mhm.
like not all, like most of my guests, I asked Peter to compile a list of some of his favorite music that inspires him the most. And I'm just going to read it quickly because listeners can find it on Adagio, the Bruckner Ninth, conducted by Karajan with the Berlin Philharmonic, the Mahler
Or the
Second,
Horenstein.
and pardon me,
Or the Yaka Horenstein as well. I have them
or the
both.
Hohenstein, yes,
They're
with
a
the
tough call.
BBC. Um, then the Mahler Second Symphony and the Mahler Sixth Symphony, which we heard 3 days ago. Um, Mahler is probably your favorite of all composers. Many people say that. I hear you. I get it. Um, and you also commended Klaus Tenstedt, about whom we were speaking, and Karajan conducted the sixth. Then you have from Verdi, Leona Mitchell singing La Vergine degli Angeli from La Forza del Destino. And then you created a kind of video that I watched, and it's charming. It's on YouTube, and it's called, what do you call it in English?
Joe Green's Blues.
Joe Green's Blues. And there are four young girls, they're girls,
Mhm.
and one of them, the one who's the lead singer, sounds to me like the late Olivia Newton-John.
Mhm.
Her voice sounds like
It's
that, and it's a
wonderful.
very beautiful thing, and I'll leave it at that. O mio Babino Caro from Puccini, from Gianni Schicchi, Montserrat Caballé. You have a story about that?
I do. When I was a kid, that was the first opera recording I ever bought. There used to be a band back in the 70s called Renaissance. Do you remember Renaissance? And they had this marvelous singer, Annie Haslam, who was a
Hmm.
trained opera singer. She trained under Sybil Knight, the British soprano, and I loved their music. And they regularly tossed bits and pieces of classical music into their tunes. And there was a radio station in New York for many years called WNEW FM. It was the leading rock station, and it was a marvelous station
Yeah.
that played a little bit of everything. Really wonderful. And they had a show on Sunday mornings called Mixed Bag with Pete Fornatel, wonderful
Mhm.
DJ, God rest his soul.
Yep, he
And
was.
he had Annie Haslam on as his guest one day a million years ago. And he said to her, "When are you going to do a classical album? With your voice, you should do a classic." And she said, there are some talks about that. And on his radio show, she did the Bakuno Ave Maria, which I knew from church as a kid. And she did another one that I had never heard, a cappella. And it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard in my whole life. So, what did you do in those days? There was no internet. I called the radio station and
Yeah.
said, what was the name of the song she sang? And they said, "You got me. If you figure it out, call us back because we have ASCAP to deal with." And so it was a real issue. So in the good old days, I left my name and number with the radio station, and they
Yep.
said, "If we find out, we'll give you a call." And a couple of days later, the radio station called me and said the name of the song was O Mio Bambino Caro.
Big mistake. Yeah.
So I wrote that down, went to my dad, and said, "Dad, I need to get a copy of this song." So my dad drove me to Sam Goody in the Paramus Park Mall, excuse me, the Garden State Plaza Mall,
record
in
store, the
in
record store in New York at
Sam
that
Goody
time.
was a big record store back in the 70s. And we drove there, and I said to the guy, I need to buy this song. And he looked at it, and I'll never forget it. He goes, which version? I don't know. And he said, well, do you want the whole opera or just the aria? I said, I want this. And he said, okay, do you want to buy a collection or do you want to buy? And my dad said, I'll handle this.
Mhm.
My dad was a construction worker, man of not many words, said, listen, bud. He goes, find this thing for me and find it quick, okay? And and the guy was like, okay, and he brought us to the collections, the big full discs uh
Right.
of the opera. And he said, he explains to me, he goes, that's from an opera, Johnny Skiki, which is part of a trilogy, which, and I'm like listening, and my dad says, yeah, how much? And he says, $39.
Mm,
$39 in 1978 or whatever. Are
that's a
you
lot.
insane? You know? And so he says, that's why I asked you. And my dad said, is it on a 45? Do they have a 45? And he says, no, it's not on a 45.
Individual disc. Yeah.
So he said, but there are collections of Puccini arias that's on. He says, okay, point us there. So this is the old days of vinyl where you had you'd go through the
Okay.
records and pull them out. Yeah. And so my dad says, I said to him, Pop, there's like a million records here. I don't know which one to buy. And he says, I'll handle this. And he goes through and he pulls out Montserrat Caballé. I said, okay. I said, are you familiar with her? He goes, no, but rule of thumb. He goes, when it comes to opera singers, the bigger the better. He says, and this broad is bigger than the damn piano.
And better.
Better. And that was to say an eye opener was beyond belief.
Yeah.
I went home, put it on, and I remember O Mio Babino was the first song on side two of that album, that LP. And as I listened, I said, wow, this other track is just as good. And so is this one. And so is this one. And so is this one. Oh my God. Every single song. There were 10 songs or nine on this vinyl disc, one better than the next. So I was completely blown away. And my dad said to me, do you want to get another one? And see if you want to, if I said, no, this is fine. I don't think I ever need to buy another record for the rest of my life. This will be the quintessential one. So of course, is like everybody else, I got 10,000 copies of that at
Sure.
this point. And it wasn't until he came home and said, I was in Times Square, and there was a guy from the Strand bookstore selling cassettes. He goes, I got a La Boheme for you if you want to give that a listen. I said, sure. And I said, the NBC Symphony Orchestra.
Ah,
Oh, Licia
ah,
Albanese. Wow, when was this thing recorded, Dad? He goes, God knows. So it was inexpensive,
yeah.
two cassette thing. And that was the first opera I'd ever listened to. And so I was like mad for Puccini when I was in high school. Uh, and it was like nothing I'd ever heard before. And that's why I had to put O Mio Babino down there on that list, because if I hadn't heard Annie Haslam sing that on the radio, I might never have had, I probably would have discovered it, but probably not early or as passionately.
Right.
Because when you discover things in your formative years, I think they stick with you for a lifetime,
Absolutely.
you know?
So two more. Lohengrin, Infernum Lan, UC barely in Swedish, is perfect, even though it's in Swedish.
Yeah.
I'm gonna leave it at that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And then the list, Dante's Symphony Magnificat. Now, um, when we were talking before about Metropolis,
Mm-hmm.
that he could have been a priest or he could have been a musician. I almost said, but I held it. Oh, like Franz Liszt. And I was thinking about that. And today being Good Friday, and I don't ask people about their faith and spirituality and so on. You mentioned a couple of times you've gone to church. You
Mm-hmm.
have done in your work books about prayer. You've recorded music
Mm-hmm.
with artists such as Aprile Milo and Maria Vetere, Ave Marias. Um, I'm not asking a question, I'm just putting it out there, music and faith
Mm-hmm.
on Good Friday.
I always listen to Parsifal on Good Friday. The intro to Parsifal is another one of those things that brings you closer to God. Those harmonies and the weaving melodies, there's just nothing like it.
Mhm.
Um, it gives me goosebumps. It stirs my soul. The Dante Symphony, which I mentioned there, um, that choir at the end is just one of the most stunning. I only saw it performed once live, and I always had that moment of like, why doesn't this symphony get more recognition? Why don't people adore this one? Um, and review after review said it's a second-rate composition. It's this, it's that. And I guess at at the end of the day, it's whether it speaks to you or not.
Yeah.
And that one speaks to me in a fashion like few other pieces ever have. I close my eyes and I think of the eternal when I hear that. And I don't think about the nonsense of today. I think about, higher thoughts and higher issues. And it really, I think if more people listened to it, there'd be less evil in the world because it just stirs your soul in such a deep, deep way. And that's what music can do that nothing else can. In an abstract way, it touches on things in your brain and in your heart. Um, the when you heard the Mahler the other night, the Andante in Mahler 6, I just say, how did a human being conceive of this?
Yeah.
The swirling and just the cascading. First, it's the first violins, then the oboe, then the second violins. It's like just, and that's also a reason why you got to bring your kids to see this stuff live. Okay. Because when you sit in front of the orchestra and you hear that, you get the spatial elements of it, that it's going from here to there to back there to here. And that's, you don't get that on a CD.
Never.
Have to be in the house to hear that. And it's so, so special. There's nothing that can compare to it. Nothing in our lives that there are a lot of wonderful things in our lives, but nothing, in my view, touches you in that fashion, quite like live music.
Yeah.
Of that,
I have another play idea for you.
yes.
Gustav Mahler and Sigmund Freud went for a walk on a beach in Leiden in the Netherlands. We don't know what they spoke about.
Okay.
And you need the lifeguard.
That's great.
And
uh,
cigars.
I had an idea a long time ago about a play about Mahler and his wife.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I didn't do it because there've been a couple of films, really, really, and not great ones.
No.
They were well intentioned, but they were um, never all that great. And for whatever the reason, I mean, I remember thinking that Maria Callas's life would be an unbelievable movie, and there's been so many that have all been mediocre.
Yeah.
Um, I wrote a novel, which I think you have read, the Tenor, which was also Maria Callas is one of the major characters in it. We're adapting that into a musical right now. Keep you posted.
Right.
because it's all public domain. It's all, yeah, and the music's ravishing, obviously. And her story, I was reading uh, when I released the book, which is over 10 years ago now, when I was doing book talks, I opened the book talk saying, show of hands, how many people here have ever heard of Ariana Stanisopoulos? And nobody raises their hand. And I say, how many have heard of Ariana Huffington? And every hand goes up. I said, same person. And before she married the billionaire from Texas, she was Ariana Stassinopoulos, and her claim to fame was her biography of Callas,
And
which
her
is
book about conductors.
and her book about conductors. But her book about Callas read like a thriller.
Yeah.
It was so interestingly paced and everything, had all of these crazy anecdotes that no other biographies had. And then she came under criticism. A lot of people said no other people had it because they didn't happen.
Right.
But uh, there was one anecdote in there in which Callas spoke about an Italian soldier who used to sit outside her window and listen to her vocalize. And I said, that makes perfect sense because an
Does.
Italian soldier away from home,
In
hears
Verona.
someone
Yeah.
hearing an opera. I mean, it
Yeah.
makes perfect sense,
I
you
get
know.
that.
And a million years ago, my ex-wife's, ready for this, follow this lineage. My ex-wife's mom, she worked for a company that was an import-export company that was in the Empire State Building. And one of the people she worked with was a guy named Christian Bischini. Bischini was the last person Callas spoke to before she died on the phone. Yeah. Callas had a good friend named Chiarini. I love these names. Chiarini was a designer. He worked with Madame Bicchi, who designed all of Callas's gowns. Chiarini came to America and brought Bicchi's fashions to America. My ex-mother-in-law's company handled the import-export of that stuff. And so my ex-mother-in-law, I don't say knew Callas, but spoke to her periodically on the phone when she was ordering stuff from these guys. And Bischini was very, very tight with her. And he basically said to me, "Oh, if you ever need to anyone to proof your story about her, send it to me. I could tell you what's real and what's BS." I said, "Okay." The Italian soldier who listened from he goes, "Oh, that's true." He goes, that did happen." He said she was in love with the guy. He was tall and handsome, and she was short, fat, and ugly. So she um, never did anything. She hid behind the curtains. Never really showed him who she was or anything. She'd rather keep the myth alive. He said, after the war was over, she toyed with the idea of trying to find him. I said, "Oh, that's really fascinating." I said, "Did she ever?" He said, "Well, Peter, we didn't have internet back then. There was no."
No.
He says, "Plus, he says, you're not aware of the Italian history because American books don't tell you." He said, "When the war ended in America, the war really didn't end yet in
No.
Italy. There was a civil
Not at all.
war. There was all kinds of
New
chaos."
Constitution, June 2nd, 1946.
Yeah.
All that. It was very divisive. The
So he said,
opening to communism, all that. Yeah. The
it was
Vatican.
just a
Yeah.
big mess. So he says, "Yeah, but that was something that was close to her heart, that this guy sat out there at night defying his own curfew to
Oh,
listen to
nice.
her." So I said, that guy is fascinating to me.
So if it's a musical,
Yeah.
you can start by having a bunch of nuns sing, "How do you solve a problem like Maria?" It exists already. Richard Rogers won't mind.
It's and for decades they've tried to solve that, Maria,
I
and no
know.
one's figured it out.
So,
But
Peter Danish, it has been a magnificent conversation. I look forward to getting to know
thank you
you
so
in life.
much.
We live nearby each other. Um, Before we end up, I want to mention something to my audience. Thank you. You have been a magnificent audience. I'm not speaking in the past tense, but next week is my 5th anniversary of doing this show.
Oh, congratulations.
And I've done more than 260 episodes, I think, last time I counted. And every Friday, through pandemic, through wars, through elections, through everything, I began by doing shout outs to people home with COVID, then shout outs to people in war zones, then hope that the world gets better. I still hope the world gets better. We're going to have to work at it. And next week, um, there's an artist I've wanted to converse with forever. I think she's wonderful. It's not that she's resisted me, it just hasn't happened. But just about every artist I've ever wanted to speak to, I've spoken to, but not this one. So, ladies and gentlemen, for my 5th anniversary show, mezzo soprano Susan Graham will be my guest.
Oh,
And I can't
wonderful.
wait. Because
Awesome.
the way you were talking about Liszt and Mahler, I feel that way about Hector Berlioz.
Mm,
And she's one of
and
the great
she's the
Berliozians, and
one.
I love her work. And so I'm thrilled that Susan Graham will be there. I'm thrilled that Idagio has allowed me to do this in 5 years, and I'm thrilled that people around the world have found it meaningful. And it's always meaningful when I have guests like Peter Danish. And so, Peter, I thank you very much.
Thank you, Fred.